Okay, well, thanks for coming. I excuse the room choice. This literally was the only room Sachi was able to find. Next time, maybe we should try to get like the basketball stadium or something like that. Whether we can fit the big crowds we tend to draw to these events. Um, so I'm really pleased that you all came. Thank you very much. This is the first of the FFERAL lecture series this year. We're only doing three this year, so you were one of three. So a little more pressure to be really good. FFERAL stands for Forest and Fire Ecology Random Lectures Series. Hey, Matt, there's room up here too, unless you want to sit on the garbage can. Okay. So I want to note a couple things. First of all, this is a California Fire Science Consortium event. Thanks for coming. And thanks for sponsoring. They are also running the who's that guy over there? They're also running the video. And as you know, you can virtually join these. Please come here. In 2 weeks, Matt Thompson will be here from Pyrologics, who some of you may know. He'll be talking about risk planning, stuff like that. And then 2 weeks later, Solomon Dabrowski will be here from the University of Montana to talk about conifer regeneration, and he'll be here jointly hosted by us and by the Standard EVE lecture series. So he'll be, I can't remember what room that's in this court. That's in the basketball court? Okay, yeah, okay. Right. I always had a teaching and learning complex personally. Anyway, so I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Katharyn Duffy, who is the senior scientist at Vibrant Planet. Kat and I got to know one another like 4 years ago at this point when we both started with Vibrant Planet. Kat's also an adjunct professor at the Northern Arizona University, and she works on a lot of interesting stuff. What always struck me about you was your amazing energy, your ability to juggle lots of things at once, and you are just a guru for large data sets and how to deal with really complex problems. We were dealing with building this insanely complicated platform in Vibrant Planet, which we just published a paper on, by the way, the other day. And Kat was in the middle of all of it. Pretty amazing stuff. She's going to talk today about, well, you're obviously going to tell them what you're going to talk about, but really great work, stuff that I was savvy about already a couple of years ago. And I got the chance at the AFA conference to see your talk. This is essentially going to be the same talk, I guess. But looking at, it's one of the first example I know of a long-term broad scale assessment of how fuel reduction activities are affecting ecosystem services like carbon. And she's going to talk a little bit about some of the hydrological work they're doing as well. Anyway, welcome.
Thank you. No, thanks so much for the invitation, Q. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to ignore my phone over here. Yeah, it's interesting. Okay. Let's see. Here we go. So to make sure this works. Ooh. Yeah.
Just don't make any sudden movements.
Let's see. I can't change. Let me stop sharing. Oh, wait, here we go. Over here. Okay, there we go. Okay, so here's what I'm going to talk to you all about today. Also, thanks for squeezing in the tiny room, and I'm actually hoping that it'll make this more interactive and fun. Feel free to, like there will be a couple places where I'm going to give you like a little bit of some chapters in this book of what I've been working on and where we're headed. And so there'll be some kind of placeholders to have a little bit more discussion as we move through. I'm going to talk about sort of the origin story of this work, the recent paper that we published last year on some of the carbon benefit quantification approaches, and then how that's been evolving, and the other sort of ecosystem services or impact metrics that we're now measuring through a similar approach. So for that reason, I'm actually going to spend a decent amount of time on the methods because they're important, I think, especially in the invitation here. Like, what are some methods that allow us to unlock these, being able to pull out these types of metrics around the effectiveness of treatments at scale and with regard to what and for how long, you name it. Okay. Also, my laptop is on a podium. Can people online hear me? Hopefully. If not, put it in the chat maybe for Sachi. Okay, so part one is the origin story. And this part isn't lost on this audience, but I thought it might be worthwhile to kind of zoom out, like, why on earth am I talking about all this? Why have I been obsessed with it and thinking about it for 15 years? And really the origin story of this work was, so I hail from Flagstaff, Arizona. I was a master's student and basically a bunch of really brilliant minds like Pete Foulé and Matt Furteau and let's say who else? Marcus Selig, who's at NFF. They're all sort of thinking about, okay, in the Southwest, we have an overabundance of dug hair thickets of ponderosa pine. Those treatments are really expensive. How on earth can we find creative ways to pay for that? And so they said, well, okay, Kat, can you figure out if there's a carbon benefit associated with fuel reduction treatments? Because basically this gigantic fire debt and how that debt is coming to bear is a challenge. And there are markets or mechanisms in order to potentially monetize some of the carbon benefit. And so way back in like 2011, 2012, this is what we were thinking about. Okay, so what's happened since then? Well, back when I started this work, way back in 2012, and I'm going to show you some of the early work, people were like, oh, well, there's a lot of carbon on the landscape, but I don't know, that's fine, right? There's less in the atmosphere. But all the research was showing that wildfires are getting larger and more frequent and burning, like the fire season's extending, like over every dimension was fire getting more extreme. But people kept on being like, well, I don't know, maybe not so much of an issue. Now, instead of talking about mega fires, now we're talking about like rapid spread or single day growth fires, right? This whole dynamic is changing. When I was at AFI and AGU last December, I heard this controversial, but I totally agree with that statement that the term mega fire is dead. Now what we're talking about is these rapid, like these fast moving single day growth fires, right? So this is, now I'm going to go into the early work, my sort of like master student brain. So at the time, this is how we were thinking about the cost benefit from a carbon perspective of proactive fire fuel reduction treatments. And I drew a really terrible mathematical diagram, and my colleague and friend Victor Leshek turned it into beautiful sci art. So he gets all the credit for this. So at the time, what we were debating was, okay, there's a lot of carbon in these forests, and they're a sink of carbon. And there's some chance that, a fire occurs and there's a large pulse of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So there's some chance that this side happens. But if we're doing treatment, there's 100% chance that this side happens, right? And so like, oh, well, but there's emissions associated with logging and you're removing biomass from the forests and like, all these downstream emissions, right? But here's what they were missing, or here's what we were missing in the debate in the literature at the time, was basically what I like to say, the bottom of the iceberg, right? So it's not, so that actual fire event itself is this tip of this iceberg where there's a pulse of carbon emissions to the atmosphere. But at the time, when I wrote this back in 2011, 2012, these were the ratios of, okay, it's not just the fire, but often there's delayed regeneration or regeneration of alternate ecosystems, right? We might move to a shrub grassland. We might move back to an overstocked forest, which puts us back in this life cycle, or there's some amount of chance that that fire is functional and, we're kind of in a more historic stand structure. But so really people were focused on the fire event itself, and the lion's share of the overall impact is not in the fire itself, but it's all the downstream consequences, right? So when we look at the full iceberg compared to this, now we're starting to see like, oh, okay, I get it. This is about things like, let's say, it's basically about intercepting high severity fire and removing carbon in order to stabilize carbon on the landscapes, right? And, little master student me basically telling people like, oh, you got to remove carbon to save carbon. They're like, you're nuts, get out of here, right? This is like, traditionally, forest carbon projects have been about maximizing storage. So this whole durability component was pretty new. And this whole shifting from this high density, high volatility to medium density or low density, low volatility was really about maintaining intact forests. And obviously everything I'm going to talk about, again, not lost on a fire science consortium, but a fire, someone with fire ecology is coming in and trying to talk about forest carbon, and people didn't really know how to put those pieces together. Anyway, okay, so again, back to master student me. Basically, I started working with the Coconino National Forest and the FFERAL, which is a large CFLRP in Arizona that covers 2.4 million acres, and working with them to sort of think about, okay, like what types of treatments are you planning and how can we start to quantify those benefits? So this is some FES modeling I did way back in the day on the Craig Watershed Protection Project. And so what we did is we modeled the real treatments that actually they had planned, and then we were modeling high severity fire, pointing at these treatments. And what you can see when I was talking about the stability is like, this is what we're talking about, right? We're throwing high severity fire at these planned treatments, and this is above ground life carbon, right? And so what we see is this kind of plateau or stability. We're not seeing this maximize storage durable, right? Where does that delta go? It goes into the deadwood pool. It goes into that wildfire emissions pool. And there's some opportunity here to repurpose some of that removed biomass for some end use. You know, at the time, NAU was considering like a bioenergy plant on campus to generate energy, you know, all sorts of potential end uses, right? But the problem with this is modeled, right? And so people say, well, how do you know what fire is going to occur? How do you know what the total benefit could be? Because much like every other region of the Western US, there's really big fire years. There's really low fire years. We might have, you know, we might do some treatments and then we have a number of really wet winters and springs, and suddenly is that, you know, all that ingrowth, right? How can we know? So that's what really, so now kind of entering the next phase, right? That's what sort of led me to this new and different type of approach. One that is, let's say I got to this approach kind of around during like COVID, right? And was thinking a lot about contagion and epidemiology and all sorts of things that were like in the news every day. And I started thinking about like, you know, there's some, let's like zoom out and think about other methods where they're dealing with population censuses and contagious things, right? So basically this kind of, I zoomed out and I have a remote sensing background as he was mentioning. I was like, okay, well, we can see the stuff from space, right? And you know, this is from the bootleg fire, kind of classic. You see this in like every fire ecology talk, right? And sometimes you can see it like this, but it's almost never this simple. Almost never, right? That's why this picture is used all the time, because you can actually see it. But we live in this computation and data rich era, right? And so what we can do, and like, you know, all these different machine learning approaches are helping us get to wall-to-wall annual cadence above ground like biomass and like carbon layers, right? And there's lots of entities out there and like government efforts and entities producing this type of data. And then we can say, so that's what brings us to the first paper I'm going to talk about, or like the paper I'm going to talk about. The rest is going to be what we're kind of evolving to. And this is where I'm going to lean in on the methods quite a bit. There's the QR code for the paper. I can pull it up again at the end. But this is the paper we just published last June. Okay. So here's the study area. And what we wanted to do is we've been working on these methods, borrowing from epidemiology and all these things that were bouncing around in my head. And we decided to do a very stringent test of this approach. And what do I mean by stringent? What we did is we took basically the Central Sierra region, and we chose a single type of treatment, one that's quite intense. If we're thinking about a carbon benefit, let's look at thinning and density reduction treatments, which generally speaking, part of the early critiques were like, well, you're removing carbon, but there's all those other emissions downstream. Like, how can you know? So we chose a pretty intense treatment, and we chose a single year so that we would have a sufficient sample size. So here we have like 110, I think, different thinning treatments that were completed in 2016. And what I'm going to show you is across that sample, how they performed over time. Maybe one or two other things, they're along a different elevational gradient. There's some other, we tried to get like a little bit of variability and like, trying to answer the question of like, how are you sure this isn't like, if we only chose a single treatment, how do you know that's not a unicorn, right? Okay, so down to the methods and, my brain absorbing all this epidemiology during COVID. So we chose a natural experimental design. And in this natural experimental design, we have treatments that actually happened, right? And so we had 78 observations of treatments that actually happened. Oh, this table's out of date. We have 200 and something-ish. Apologies for that. Then we have this reference region or census-based control. And I'm going to show you how this works, but this is going to be our first counterfactual. Okay, so we're going to measure treatments against landscape scale patterns. Then we're going to have null treatments. So these are kind of like placebos, right? So we have treatments, but then we're going to take the shape and orientation and the properties or attributes inside of an actual treatment, throw it all over the landscape. And that helps us actually measure a different component here, which is going to be the sort of likelihood that if you're 1 pixel inside of a treatment, the pixel next to you is likely to burn, right? There's that contagion component. It also helps us understand how conservative our first control is. And then we do that one more time, just to be sure. Okay, so this control area or reference region delineation, how does this work? Here we have an ecoregion, level 4 ecoregion, and this little orange dot right here is an actual treatment that actually got implemented in 2016. We do this for the 200 plus treatments in our case study, but this is kind of to help you understand how does it work, right? So we have an ecoregion because we want ecological context. We wouldn't want to be comparing ponderosa pine forests in Flagstaff with ones up on like the dry side of the Cascades. That's not an appropriate comparison. And okay, and then we start to filter for attributes that are inside an actual treatment polygon. So here, we're looking at percent vegetation cover. And what you're going to see here on the bottom is the size of our reference region or census-based control relative to the actual treatment itself. Then we add things like wildfire hazard potential, road access and slope, and here's where we want to get at the sort of feasibility, right? We don't want to be comparing a treatment in like along a WUI corridor or that has road access with something that's out in the wilderness, right? Where you actually aren't able to get in there and do mechanical thinning, something like that. And we also filtered for existing vegetation type. And this is what it ends up looking like at the end. And this has one final step where we bin. You know, there's lots of values of above ground biomass and carbon, because that's the thing we're trying to measure. We do one final binning filter to say like, okay, what are the bounds of what's true in the project? Let's make sure that we're also filtering out things in our reference region or control area that are outside of those bounds. And essentially, what I'm trying to describe here is, I think that this is incredibly essential when we're thinking about this stochastic and spatially heterogeneous disturbance like fire. A population census-based control is incredibly important because we don't know where fire is going to happen and when. It's back to that question people were asking me about the FES outputs. Well, how do you know? How do you know? Okay, but we have that second type of control. And so this is that placebo. So here we have a real treatment in green. And you know, in that series of filters, what we're seeing is there are fewer and fewer blacker dots, right? So these are pixels that would be within a control area, reference region. So here we have a real treatment in green. And then what we do is we take that real treatment and we place it all over the landscape, thousands of times, right? And so this one we wouldn't include because it doesn't have sufficient cover of all the matching criteria, right? But this is an example of one that would be included. But then this happens hundreds and hundreds of times. And so that allows us to measure this kind of like cohesive equivalent shape to a real treatment. It allows us to measure the uncertainty in the baseline, as in is our counterfactual actually measuring a likely potential other outcome? And it's getting at that contagion effect. So here are some examples of how we would compare that. So you say, what's the existing vegetation cover in the actual project versus in the placebo? Same for wildfire hazard potential and megagrams of carbon per hectare. And so here's what I'm talking about with that sort of binned filter, right? Why would we go through all of this effort? Because especially where we're going to do what I'm going to borrow some carbon terms here, an ex post or monitoring based assessment, what we really want to make sure we're understanding is that at time equals 0, before something happens, that the trajectory is likely to be the same, right? So this whole approach is pinned upon that. Okay, so now we actually get to look at a few of the results. So just for your mental model, for the rest of this, blue is always going to be the actual treatments themselves, and orange is all of the different controls. And so what we're looking for is blue different than orange in general, right? Okay, so our first result, here we have the treatments, these controls, and we have composite burn index fire severity. right? So that's it's a categorical derivative of RDNBR used widely in remote sensing of fire severity. What we're looking at is low, medium, and high severity fire. So first pass, what do we see? We see, okay, in our controls, we see a pretty cohesive signal in that distribution, right? They're all left-tailed to the right. And then here in our treatments, what we see is mixed severity fire. And I think this group gets it, but a lot of times people are like, well, why isn't it all low severity fire? And the question is, well, first, like, is that even functional? Is that what we'd want? Like, mixed severity, patches of high severity, low severity, moderate severity fire is actually probably often the goal. And also we're going to get into a little bit of the like, and it doesn't work every time component, right? So first off, what we end up seeing is the flattening or wider distribution of fire severity in treated areas compared to all of these different controls.
So, Kat, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Quick question.
Yeah, please.
We're talking about simulation online.
This is all remote sensing. This is a time series.
So how do you get the data? Well, we didn't really do this treatment here, but now we're seeing this fire severity through it. So I'm not really following that, how that's happening. So I assume there's a simulation you're running some fire.
Yeah, so we're not, so what we're actually, let me see if I skip forward. This one might help a little bit, but I think that's a real, and anyone else, please interrupt me if you have a question. Like, I'd love this to be a dialogue. One of many reasons why we chose density or thinning reduction, or density reduction / thinning, is that we could verify that we saw a change in the above ground live biomass in the actual pixels themselves or the polygons themselves to say, like, are we sure that something happened here as a part of that stringent test? So the treatments were implemented in 2016. We can do is look at 2015, 2016, 2017, change in above ground live biomass, not for fire, but for like, in the absence of fire, and say like, oh, look, there definitely was a significant dip in this polygon. Therefore, something really did happen.
So you were showing us if fire at low intensity came through this CBI index.
Yeah, so this previous graph is basically saying these were 2016 treatments, and we monitored them all the way to 2024, maybe 2023. I'll have to look at our time in the later graphs. Here's the distribution of CBI inside of treatment polygons to pass some of those tests that, something really did happen. And this is all of our controls.
I think what she's getting at is you actually monitored fires at these sites.
Yes.
Yeah, these are not modeled. This is actually a fire that is through the site. Yeah, so you say that, yeah.
Yeah, this is actual fires that really occurred.
So that is part of your filter is did it burn?
Yeah, in this graph.
So your treatments were placed, your big treatments were placed in places that were.
Exactly. So in this null treatments and these placebos, what we see is that they were first, what we see is that they do share the same shape as our census-based control, right? And that they did likely, or they did sort of cohesively burn. So it makes this kind of tells us that these are a good proxy for what would have happened in the absence of treatment. Good questions though, and as we get through more of it, like keep asking because
Oh, I will. Don't.
Yeah.
Follow up on that?
Yeah.
How many of those treatments actually burned?
Yeah, I think it was about.
These questions, I think, probably.
Oh yes, and so there's a question around how many of the treatments burned. I think I might have a statistic on that. I want to say that it was about 60 to 70% of the treatments burned.
I was going to say the 78.
Yeah, maybe it's my old table. But to that end, we had treatments that did not burn, and we had treatments that burned. Okay. So here, what we see, so this is the next question that I often got back in the day, is like, well, what if it never burns? How do you know there's a benefit, or isn't there just a huge carbon cost out there, right? So on the left, what we see is treatments that did not burn, and we see that big dip, that treatment thinning signal, right? And then we see this recovery, and it's important to note that this was a time period. Okay, so we did it through 2023. This is a time period that had quite intense drought in the region, right? And so what we see is all of these controls, they're just sort of plateaued, right? They're like at a sufficient density, stand density index that they're not really able to sequester a lot more carbon, especially during a drought. They're pretty just plateaued and stable. We see the dip of a treatment, and then we see that rebound despite intense drought because of that release from overstocking. Okay, on the right-hand side, we're going to see this fire signal, and we're going to dive deeper because it matters what intensity of fire, right? So here we see that same dip from a treatment. Here's where we start. Everyone starts in the same place. And then where fire occurs, we do see a loss, right? But we see less of a loss than we do under no action, under our controls. But there's more to that, right? So what's in that fire signal? We looked earlier at that, the distribution of low, moderate, and high severity fire, right? So what we end up seeing is that a larger percent of the treated areas experience low severity fire and moderate severity fire. And here the width is relative to the total sample. We only saw 2% of the treatments experience high severity fire, right? And where we have high severity fire, we do lose a lot of carbon because that's what's happening, right? It's being incinerated. But another interesting critique that has happened over time is like, okay, well, you removed carbon in order to reduce fire severity. But what if that all just goes up in smoke and the net signal is worse? What we don't see in carbon terms is a reversal here. Like we're not, because this is already accounting for the fact that we removed a bunch of carbon when we did the treatment. We still don't go underneath all of our controls. So the net signal is more like 0 as opposed to net emissions. Does that make sense?
But that isn't true for low and moderate, just.
Yeah, especially like that was, I was focusing a little bit more on the high. You know, this one, it kind of pencils out a bit, right? And we're going to get into a little bit more of that nuance. Sorry, do I see one more hand? Yeah.
Oh, I was just gonna say the previous slide. It seems super important that just you see such a strong signal of growth.
Yeah.
Stimulation of growth.
Mm-hmm.
That's really widespread.
Yeah, and then this is just,
super important.
this is a sample size, you know, of like 200-ish treatments. And this is also a type of treatment that is really targeting like density reduction in the release, right? We would likely see a different signal in this from like, say, ladder fuel reduction or mastication, something like that, right? And in the second part, we'll kind of get into those between different types of treatment signals. Because again, this one was like, let's pick a year, let's pick a really intense treatment, and let's see how it pencils out.
So I have one more question.
Yeah.
I'm just curious how you measured that. How are you measuring carbon remotely?
Yeah, so we're using a remotely sensed, we're actually using the NASA CMS, like the carbon monitoring system, 30-meter resolution data product.
Because I don't know how you, I always wonder this.
Mhm.
Conversations, right? Taking a little bit.
Yeah.
Is how we account, like a lot of times when you're talking carbon, there's a certain point they start counting carbon when a tree gets a certain size. But as far as like other vegetation growth, they don't have a good way to quantify that. So it kind of gets like swept under that.
Right.
So I didn't know if how your mention played into that conversation.
Yeah.
Well, vegetation is growing, it might not be trees, and it is sequestering carbon, it might be underground, you know.
Yes. And so this would be remotely sensed, technically it's a biomass data product.
Yeah.
So it'd be a remotely sensed above ground live biomass. We're cutting that in half in order to get to carbon, right? And to your point, part of what those layers attempt to do is actually look more at volume, you know, look at the total volume of that system. They don't always perform well where there's like an understory that's hard to see from space. There's also a lot of work in the sort of validating and like, you know, agreement between field-based inventories and remotely sensed data products, which obviously is outside the scope of today's paper and presentation. I mean, we do mention it quite a bit in the paper, but I do have some teammates at Vibrant Planet that actually just published a big validation paper kind of looking at the fidelity of remotely sensed biomass via versus different stand-in inventory data sets to kind of look at that certainty and uncertainty. So this is all 100% remotely sensed above ground live biomass. We would see a lot more nuance if we could combine that with field-based inventories, which if anyone wants to do that, I'm game. Okay. Okay, so here's the sort of full picture So we had the fire, no fire, fire by different severity classes. Here's the full picture over time. And what we end up seeing is that, we end up sort of getting to this net positive at the sort of broader landscape scale. So here is that sort of return on investment time series view. What we're going to look at here is if you're blue and you're up above the zero. Oh yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Do
Go
you
for it.
consider like outside of the treated areas that?
The question is, do we think about like treatment shadow effects and benefits outside of the perimeter?
Just adjacent. not treated ones, but reduce the problem.
Right.
Carbon emissions.
Right. I'm just going to repeat the question for people online. Okay, so we're talking about the additional benefits outside of the direct perimeter of treatment itself and how there's likely to be reduced fire behavior, severity, emissions, et cetera, outside. In this analysis, we conservatively did not, but we're actually going to get to some of that in part 2. But yeah, okay, so to orient you to this graph and how to think about it is if we're above and in blue, the project is outcompeting its controls, like the doing something is outcompeting not doing anything, and vice versa, right? So here we have 2015, everyone should look the same, roughly speaking, right? Because we haven't done anything yet. And then in 2016, we implemented treatment. So, and here each dot is a different individual density reduction treatment that was implemented in 2016. And so what we see is, yes, there is quite a large carbon or biomass cost associated with removing these living trees. And that cost persists for some time, right? Then, so for a couple of years, basically, we're at a net, like we're at a debt of carbon or biomass, right? But then we start to hit some of the larger fire years in California, coincident with drought, right? And now we see the 2020, 2021, 2022 signals. And as fire is crossing these landscapes, we start to see this net positive return on investment from that proactive fire fuel reduction treatment. And we end up at around 13 metric tons of carbon per hectare on average across the sample size of 200 plus thinning treatments. And so the average is about 13, and about 75% of the treatments outcompeted their controls. Okay, so, but there's more to this. Like, I think you read my mind. I remember where we're going to go next. Is that there's more that we can learn here. Right here, we actually have some polygons that are the treatments that were implemented in 2016. And this is the perimeter of the North Complex fire. Right. And what we can start to look at are things like, and when we say things were treated, we should acknowledge that sometimes there's follow-on treatments, things like thinning followed by surface fuel reduction, things like prescribed fire, et cetera. And that showed an even greater reduction in composite burn index fire severity. But we can also see the sort of spatial signal of these treatments, right? So we can see that there are some treatments that are kind of out on their own, and this is not exhaustive of that entire, remember we have the gigantic ecoregion with 200 plus treatments, but this kind of gives you this little zoom in. So we can see that especially that first, a lot of treatments were associated with a total final fire perimeter, right? And also that there's this constellation effect of multiple treatments in close proximity to each other that begins to change the signal of fire severity. Okay, last part of this talk, and then I will maybe give you guys a teaser, because like we're getting lots of good questions and I would rather have like lots of cool discussion about the methods. And maybe I'll give you a teaser of some of that water stuff. But there's one other component here is also around learning what fails, right? Let's not pretend that this is like a bulletproof insurance policy to retain forests and or reduce high severity fire. Here we're looking at the Calder, Dixie, and North Complex fires, and we're looking at the mean composite burn index, and we're looking at the size of the treatments. And so what we saw is that larger treatments, generally speaking, performed better, which makes sense as fires entering a treated landscape, one that has a different stand structure, fuel load, etc. And we also kind of zoomed in and looked at what was the size of treatments that were entirely consumed, as in almost 100% high severity fire and basically no above ground live biomass or carbon to speak of after that fire from a remote sensing perspective. And then what was associated with some of the fire perimeter treatments. And so those were more likely to be larger. And we don't have this graph in the supplemental, but they're also more likely to be closer to another treatment. Okay, so that is part one. Any other burning questions? No pun intended.
Questions. Just want to let you know, you got about 15 minutes or
Right.
so.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not a.
Okay, I'll give you guys some cool teasers then of where this is headed. So one of my favorite jokes is that carbon is like the gateway drug of ecosystem services, because like essentially there's a market for it, right? But also we can see it from space. So it's like kind of a convenient starting place, but I don't think it's the end all be all of forest ecosystem services or benefits. It's just a good starting place. And my colleague Joe Shannon and I have been basically taking the approach that I just showed all of you. And now we're looking at a lot of other information that we can get from this type of approach. I'm going to zoom through a little bit of this, but this work is really grounded in this sort of adaptive management lifecycle loop. This is a kind of simplified version that Joe and I use to sort of, think about the fact that we always want to, we're not treating forests thinking, like, oh, this won't work at all. I'll just throw it somewhere randomly on the landscape. We're treating forests thinking that it's going to be effective, right? But I'm going to actually jump forward a little bit and say, maybe I won't. I think that graph is a little bit further down. But the sort of like, was it effective is a far more complex question than just like a binary yes, no, right? Because like in the mental model, people might say like, okay, well, it was treated or it was not treated and it's either there or it's not there. But we know that it's a lot more complex, right? Because what if it was treated and there wasn't a fire? Or what if there was a fire right after the treatment, right? What if the time between the treatment and the fire is longer and longer and longer? There's this rebound and recovery of especially a lot of that understory fuel that often comes up after a treatment. And so the ability to sort of think about this also in a time series sense is where Joe and I have been headed. And it's really around the fact, like, we were in a series of conversations with TNC and the Forest Service, and I just had this burning question in my head. I was like, well, what do you mean effective? Like, what do you mean, right? Is effective, it's a reduction in fire severity? Is it the thing that we care, protecting the thing that we care about? How are we thinking about time? How are we thinking about interannual variability in, water availability, ecosystem rebound, et cetera? And so it's like, sometimes it's clear, it's like that Boot Lake fire, but often it's not, right? And so it's also important to think about when we say what's effective, like over what time and like which metrics are we thinking about? Because sometimes people will think about like, okay, well, how did those treatments reduce that fire severity in that year? Right. And that's one way of saying, was it effective? I'm not saying any of these are wrong. I'm just saying there's nuance to the question. But you might also say, okay, well, how did it reduce the fire severity in the year that it happened? And then what is the ecosystem recovery of that thing? Maybe you care about above ground live biomass still. You can say, okay, well, there's a fire and you lost some, but look, over time, you're rebounding. But there's also this part, right? Where like, and here's just, this is a cartoon. It's just insert metric you care about. Maybe it's water, like watershed health, or it's above ground live biomass, you name it, right? So there's also this post-treatment signal, right? And then some fire happens, and what's effective really kind of depends on what part of that you care about, because not everything always burns, as we were looking at in the previous study. So, okay, this is what I was trying to get back to. Okay, so when we're planning new activities, we're doing activities because we want to apply effective treatments, right? But how can we know what's effective, for how long, where, and strategies are going to be different, in my neck of the woods and yours. So what we do is we go back and do a bunch of the evaluate and adapt in this treatment life cycle in order to learn what works, where, and for how long. Okay, so have any of you all heard about or played with the Reshape data set? It's my favorite thing on the planet. Anyone? So the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes, SWERI, have just gone through the very arduous and painstaking process of pulling all of the facts, NIF and now state level treatment databases and mashing them up together and cleaning them up and putting in error flags and removing duplicates, you name it. It's an absolutely fantastic resource. Highly recommend playing around with that. So the first thing we need to do in order to look back in time and figure out what works is we need a really large sample size of treatments. And here we're not doing that controlled stringent case study of only thinning. This is going to be everything from wildland fire use to mastication thinning, you name it, habitat restoration, right? So we need a record of treatments. We need that same sort of set of controls. So if you're interested in the sort of natural experimental design, I highly recommend this FFERAL 2021 paper. It's a great read. I was reading it during COVID when I was thinking about epidemiology. And what we need is multiple coincident metrics. Example being fire and biomass, fire and ecosystem water use or evapotranspiration, things like that. The metrics need to be sort of discrete, observable, repeatedly measurable. I'm going to skip over this, but we should talk about it later. And it'd be really cool if you have all this like ground-based inventories and stream gauge data. And they really have to match the scale of the question. So with this set of ingredients, now we can move beyond just biomass and fire and treatment. And we can start to look at everything from water to smoke impacts, you name it. So here's the list of metrics that Joe and I have evaluated and released thus far. So we have everything we were looking at in the last. We have some of the forest health and growth and reduced fire severity from the last publication. But now we're going to be looking at things like reduced water use while sustaining forest growth, reduced erosion and sedimentation, increased landscape water availability, or some of the metrics that Joe and I are releasing now. Okay, I'm going to skip over this a little bit. So here's that Reshape database. I actually have to update this now because we're over 1.4 million treatments. But I will show you some of the high level stats of like this little case study that we did on the Tahoe National Forest. And so in this case, we had 5,500 surface fuel reduction treatments, 3,000 density reduction treatments, 1,700 ladder fuel reduction treatments, 17 wildfires, and a bunch of other stuff that wasn't sort of like so easily binned in order to get a sufficient sample size. And I don't have to explain this one because we just went through the Euclidic approach, but it's going to use that same set of controls. And okay, so the treatments in this Tahoe National Forest case study. So we saw reduced water use even without affecting forest productivity. So we had a 71% reduced evapotranspiration, yielded 127 millimeters of additional water. We also saw an 87% increase in water use efficiency. And there we're thinking about how much water did you use in order to grow 1 metric ton of biomass. So here's where we're starting to get at the fact that this isn't a zero sum, right? We can retain healthy forests, we can increase productivity, and we can start to free up, water on these landscapes. And that ends up having this also feedback into thinking about fuel moistures and fire behavior, and all of it's this larger ecosystem web, but we can start to pull out metrics like this. We can also, again, so before we were just looking at those thinning treatments, but now we're looking at a much broader set of treatments and across a number of different strategies. But we could see first that a number of these treatments burned multiple times. Some of that might be because of intentional fire use or wildland fire use. We still saw a drastic reduction in composite burn index fire severity. Here's that, project blue, controls orange yet again. And we can start to track. So this is an actual just full on time series. We can start to see how much of these controls are burning and at a high severity fashion over time. And we're seeing that in these big fire years, it's not that treatments didn't burn or didn't sometimes have high severity fire, but we can see that delta between the two in a longitudinal sense. Okay, almost there. So Joe and I have been thinking a lot about exposed soil, simply because of all of the, again, no pun intended, downstream effects, right? Because where we have increased bare ground soil, we are now having increased risk of erosion. At least in my neck of the woods, a lot of that erosion happens immediately post-fire, right? We have our most active fire season in the spring, followed immediately by the monsoon season. And that's where you have a lot of these big mass wasting events where you have high severity fire, quite hydrophobic soils, and downtown floods, right? So we can see that we're reducing bare ground soil. And also, also this would matter for, stream health, and therefore all the species that rely on that, but also things like utilities and dredging and like very large movements of sediment into reservoirs that cost a lot of money in order to go dredge. Okay, so I think we covered this pretty well. It's just, I think at its core, what Joe and I are trying to do is round out this metric, and water is not going to be the end of this. So I think we're going to keep going and adding new metrics. If you have really cool ideas, come tell me about them. But our ultimate goal here is to cover a suite of metrics that we might care about, at least an initial suite. Things like reduction in fire severity, above ground live biomass, carbon, or carbon, increased water availability, and reduced erosion, right? As at least, now we're starting to have more of a basket of metrics that we can use to both engage with different partners and or start to flesh out the suite of ecosystem services and how our actions might avoid some loss. Only point here is just that the reduction in bare ground soil mattered or differed quite a bit between some of these different approaches, because often people say, well, like all this thinning work really, disturbs soil. Yes, but not as much as wildland fire. Okay. I think I'll end this here, but in these one or two last slides. But basically our argument is just that we need this sort of suite of empirical data and treatment impacts in order to understand what is working, where, why, for how long. And now, once we have, let's say we have a 5, 10, 15, 20-year time series, we can start to figure out when treatments are no longer likely to be effective, or what is the historic performance of thinning treatments or wildland fire use through the lens of metric A, B, or C. And let's say, last part here is just that I think at its core, Joe and I are thinking, and Ashley is thinking with us all the time about this, is this intersection of how do we develop scientific methods and approaches that are transparent, repeatable, rigorous, defensible, right? And how does that start to unlock, how can planners and managers gain information from that? How can lawmakers and funders, and by funders, I mean everyone in this room who's paying taxes, right? How can we understand what's most effective and be advocating for that in our community? And how can collaborators and beneficiaries help finance some of that, right? I think with that, I'll stop with 3 minutes to go for our last question. Or two.
There's no limit. Questions can go on for a while.
Okay.
At some point, if they become too onerous and, we're fisticuffs up.
Okay.
He's basically saying once Angela starts, he doesn't.
No. Somebody isn't starting. Someone else is.
Yeah.
We talked about treating, we also talked about thinning now. Ways of looking at prescribed burns through this and their effects, does it include it?
Yeah, it was only the first study that only focused on thinning. The second part with all the water and everything else. And basically, let me go back a little bit. So this Reshape database has a vast multitude of different treatment approaches or methods. And it was just, the first study was that really stringent test. So we picked like a really intense treatment. This is actually looking at all the different types of treatments that get applied on a landscape. And there is absolutely, and we see this for reduction in fire severity and above ground light biomass as well. What we've been seeing thus far is a lot of the prescribed burn and surface fuel reduction flavored work reduces composite burn index fire severity the greatest, and also has a lot of the largest returns and quickest returns from a carbon, water, etc. perspective. So yeah, there's more than just thinning. It's just the first one was like that stringent test. Great question.
You have a motivation to monetize that's like water, so it's like nicely. Monetizations of that, but. How do you see that?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a data nerd, not a finance nerd, but what I do see is organizations like Blue Forest, for example, use their forest resilience bonds. And through those forest resilience bonds, they're partnering with utilities and other service providers in order to say, like, would you be, if we can track the return on investment, if we can track the performance of this, would you be willing to contribute to financing some of the fire fuel reduction work? And, no, there isn't like a water market in the same way that there's like a voluntary carbon market, but I think that I think we over orient often to the voluntary carbon market simply because there's a multitude of different players and decision makers and stakeholders on these landscapes that really might just care about the reporting of the effects. And I don't want to just say benefits, but like, what are the outcomes? Because sometimes the outcome is negative, sometimes it's positive, but where we can have this coherent and reproducible method to generate those metrics, we can say, oh, look, look at the increase in water availability to this ecosystem. Maybe, in my neck of the woods, Phoenix has the ability to opt in and add $5 to their utility bill in order to fund forest restoration work. How do we get Salt River Project to like track, report, and fund that? These types of approaches, right? So it's not always like that exact voluntary market mechanism, and Ashley can actually answer this question even better than I can. But
Yeah, Colorado has a charge for forest deposit, and so there's a specific approach where there's a fund coming out of the water bills that goes track with the watershed. And there's also specific nonprofit organizations that are looking sometime, right? The foundation is entirely focused on Colorado water basin. They're really looking for water benefits that are measurable, so they can fund those types of projects. So it may not be a market per se, but there are organizations that
Oh, I just was, yeah, I mean, along those lines, I was gonna say, and I think a lot of people in this room will understand that, is that this, sort of along the lines of what Freddie was talking about, it's easier to close to putting numbers on these things when you've got large municipalities, a lot of water involved, a lot of political politics about that, are drawing specifically from and only from forested watersheds.
Yeah.
So like Denver, Flagstaff, Portland, why do you think that's where this stuff's happening? I mean, because they know what it costs to reduce turbidity in water,
Yeah.
with the water treatment. They can put a number on it. What we realized, and I think Fred, you guys talked about this, but our lab 7 or 8 years ago, John Williams might be online, was in charge of this whole thing. We tried to figure out the SoCal what they were paying, because they're the place in the country most affected by forests, and they got the most soil movement systems, and it's a huge issue. But in their case, they're getting water from the Feather River, the Owens River, and the Colorado River.
Right.
40% of it's coming from local reservoirs. They don't actually even know what the turbidity costs are, because they know they're too high to just shut that off. They're like, nah, we're not drawing from that watershed. We'll draw from here now. That's more money. So in SoCal, it's been very difficult to get them serious about it, because they don't know the cost and they just change water, where the water's coming from. So anyway, I think there's other complexities to that.
you could look at Empirical Water Agency. They have one reservoir. They also spend on coal. They're trying to reduce. So they were looking at peak fire, looking at their costs year over year, question fire, and how to reduce those. And they've been waiting for to potentially reduce their drainage costs year over year. So Google Water, East Bay Mud,
Yeah.
and PCC are
Right.
all three that are paying.
So it's just, and one more thing along those lines, the only thing actually able to put a real number, outside of was reduction in soil erosion, because the counties and the cities know exactly how much they spend every year in dredging the basins at the base of every canyon and SoCal. Those are not supposed to be reservoirs. Those are there to capture material that flies off those mountains every year after you've had burning. And the number is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Hundreds hundreds of millions of dollars in the average year is spent on dredging out those sediment basins. And so they know what it costs, but that's not really water, it's sediment.
Right.
Anyway,
No, I think precisely. And I think we're not pretending that every single user is going to, like, every metric will be useful. But I think what we're trying to do is chip away at the like data is better than no data. Information is better than no information, right? And I think to date, like, there's been a lot of, sometimes it just ends up being somewhat hand wavy, like, oh, there's something like this type of benefit. Like, I think we all intellectually understand, oh, we reduce the density of forests and we're using less water because there's less evapotranspiration. But the question is, like, how much and how do we know? And what kind of scale are we talking about? And I'm not saying that other people haven't answered those types of questions, but this is an attempt to have like a sort of cohesive approach in order to generate a suite of metrics. And then it might be more of like a menu of like, and what are the things you care about? Because you could do this for habitat quality. You could do this for, and our next tranche of work will actually be around integrating new types of data, things like tourism and recreation and sensor-based smoke impacts and things like that, to kind of get at all these different costs and benefits that we can start to think about monitoring, running through this framework. And for some of those, maybe like with the smoke impacts, maybe it'll be a quite muted signal. We shall see. Yeah.
So I would agree with your statement. Some data, but you can't have
Yes.
too much data, too much information.
Yeah.
So my question is, this is a great start.
Yeah.
How do you take this and synthesize it and present it in a way that can actually inform decisions about fuel treatments?
Mhm.
How much should we be doing? Where should we be doing it? At what rate should we be doing it? How do you take that step to make this information actually tangible and palatable to making decisions?
I think you might answer that question better than I can, Ashley.
Yeah, I would say that I know a bunch of people who are very, but I worked for the state for a long time on the TRPA board, and so we are making fiscal decisions about where you put this board on the ground, right? And what we're looking for, obviously, is a concentration that says, in a landscape that is similar enough to the landscapes we care about, this type of activity worked. And so it's not necessarily but we do need enough that we can justify when pursued, that we have the shooting bars in there. Basically, we need to be able to point to data and science that signals that direction enough that we can protect ourselves, honestly. I'm happy to talk about this more broadly, but that's general.
And by the way, this is a good time for me to just to interject that at 6 we're going to Sophie, so there is an opportunity to talk about fears. Hey, can I just add something to that? Okay, what kind of on the lines of what Matt was going? I mean, we know already that, like Reno, for example, has worked with. You remember the flights from USGS?
Yeah.
They've been working. I forget that stuff. Anyway, they did a bunch of modeling for them and for TNC, where they turned this whole thing on its head, and they said, okay, we want to realize multiple benefits. We need to reduce landscape fire severity for a variety of reasons. But the Truckee River is what gets us our water. We also want to increase water availability. So let's start with the soil. You tell us, where should we treat to maximize the amount of water to get off the landscape without erosion? Very cool. And you're headed in the same direction,
Right.
basically. Right?
Yeah.
Have you thought about going that direction as well?
Yeah, and so I think another part of the next place we're going to go is to look at, on ecoregion by ecoregion or landscape by landscape, what is the average signal over time across these different types of treatments and strategies, and how can that be a proxy of your return? There's also a lot of very rich information embedded in those polygons of what we actually do on the ground, right? So we can start to get even more nuanced or focused on this type of treatment in this type of forest, this type of soil group, you name it. You can start to, depending on how much you care about the nitty-gritty details, you can dive further and further and further. Another component that I've been thinking about a lot lately is, I talked about the placebos, and the placebos are basically attempting to be equivalent places, equivalent to the treatment you actually implemented. Well, those placebos in theory might be like a bunch of different polygons that you might consider doing a similar type of intervention and would likely yield a similar type of return, depending on the type of metric you're caring about. Yes.
Just a couple of questions coming in, right? Like also, would it possible, because it was a bit of a longer conversation, but just maybe like summarizing in a few sentences what we talked about so far.
Yeah, I know.
Just so that people online can hear it. So that's one thing. And then an audience member named Katharyn Michelle says, I get a lot of undergrads asking me in lecture if wildfires are a harmful source of atmospheric carbon or the carbon sink aspect of forests evens out the impact of fires. How would you answer this for a first or second year undergrad audience?
That's a great question. Okay, I might start there and then maybe we'll wrap up by summarizing some of the discussion. So I think that we often just oversimplify the role of forests when we're thinking about carbon storage and carbon emissions, right? We tend to think like, oh, look, this forest is just like securely storing all that carbon, it's all locked away. Or we're in the opposite camp, like, oh, look at these huge plumes of smoke. Like, oh, it's all gone. And the answer is because it's a living, breathing, dynamic part of our Earth system, it is both, right? I would say on average, forests are starting to emit more and more carbon to the atmosphere. That's for a multitude of reasons, even beyond fire. But if I were to simplify it, I would say that forests are most likely to have a carbon storage benefit and retain like a sufficient sink when they are in close proximity or in relationship to their historic forest structure and historic disturbance regimes. It's, a lot of the large pulses of emissions from forests, which by the way, in California, like it's quite common now for wildfires to outpace gigantic sectors of emissions in California, right? That's the scale of this problem in California. Let's see where they're going, that is happening because we are so departed from stand structures and disturbance regimes that these forests are adapted to. And so that was really, the origin story of the whole work was like, how can we think about reporting the different benefits of restoring to that historic forest structure and disturbance regime as a way to avoid the worst perils of large scale emissions and forest loss and remember that big down, the bottom of the iceberg. Okay, so that was that answer. Hopefully that was sufficient. And then what people probably couldn't hear, and then I wandered around and tried to turn on the other mic and it didn't work. But what we were talking about around the water benefits was that is maybe most acutely felt in cities where there is a watershed that is either the singular or majority source of drinking water and potable water for a community. We were also actually, when you were talking about the forest resilience bond, there was another point you made.
Colors of money.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes you have to measure all of this to match up the color of money that you're using. So
yeah,
the work that you're doing is useful, even if we don't have a market for some of this sources.
Yeah, exactly. So we were talking about colors of money, like think about monopoly money, but like some of that money is like, county level dollars, it might be like philanthropic dollars, it might be, voluntary carbon market dollars or forest resilience market or forest resilience bond finance. And so the sort of idea here is that through consistently and scalable and in a scalable fashion, reporting a suite of these outputs and metrics, that we can sort of serve those many use cases or like instances of that type of information to address the different color, the type of reporting or information that's needed to support those different colors of money.
So.
Okay, last one, best one. No pressure.
But that's mine.
Okay. Sure.
between different kinds of treatment.
Yeah.
So you are evaluating all the treatments in general, or you know different kinds of treatments, depends on feelings. For example. Yes.
Yeah, and this is, yeah, so if we actually, and I can go back in a minute. So we took the reshape treatment database and basically kind of binned it. There's a lot of very rich information in there. But like, there's a lot of, if we were to do an exact character match in reshape, right? We call like a similar treatment a lot of different things. And so the reshape treatment database has some really valuable and rich information around, what was the sort of type, like, was it mechanical or fire or like herbicides, you name it, right? And then they have sort of like activity and equipment level information. What we did is we synthesized this like, 1.4 million polygon database and sort of try to turn them into more like, what is the objective here, right? So we can retain sufficient sample size. And I can point you towards some resources for that, but the Reshape recently published a data paper where they sort of go through the, how they did all the data mashups and how people can use that information and do things like this. Because otherwise this would be, 1.4 million different columns, right? So it's like we're doing like some aggregation. I think that also is helpful. Let me actually show you one last, let's see, can I escape? Okay, let me show you one last figure I didn't show you because we were trying to fly, which is this one. Let's see, can I show just that? Yeah, okay, so we can also get it like this, I had the cute little cartoons with like, but when does fire happen? So we can also start to look at these types of signals. So this is just, again, silly cartoon, it's more complex, but time since treatment and biomass right here. Biomass is just a proxy for rebound. We have a more nuanced recipe here, but what we're looking at is, okay, a density reduction treatment, you might take a really big cut, but then you have that regrowth. But what about something like a less intense, but followed by a prescribed fire, or like how long is something like mastication effective? And then you have to remember that these are all going to have like confidence intervals on them, and they're going to be time variant. And so that's an attempt to like have a sufficient sample size from like the Reshape treatment database, so we can start to do things like this. So we can start to say like, instead of just general rules of thumb, or this treatment lasts this long, that lasts that long, let's do it in real time. Let's monitor it and learn.
Sorry.
Oh,
That's great.
So I was, a lot of these questions, I was just thinking back to one. It was one of your slides you had earlier where this is like low severity, moderate severity, high severity. And the takeaway was that when you have high severity, that carbon over some period of time, plays out. I mean, doesn't that tell you a little bit about longevity, just looking at that? I mean, you have to
oh, absolutely.
You have to say, and then also just about fuel treatment effectiveness. I mean, I'm surprised that I have to look at the slide again, think about it. Like the low and moderate, like I said, you didn't get that same way, right? Like the fuel, again, what is significant? What is it? What when I said, I'm sure there's statistical tests you did.
Yeah.
But like with the moderate severity, for instance, it's like, well, it didn't really help you out if you did a treatment on the moderate severity hit you. I mean, someone could argue that. Right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely.
But yeah, I guess that also different treatments you expect it to have the type of treatment you do. You expect, oh, well, if I do this treatment, then I still might expect low severity fire. If I did this really, like you could probably bounds on those for which of those. And I'm sure there's data that talks to this kind of treatment led to this many trees dying.
Right, definitely. And I think first, you're spot on. I think what's different between this and some of the latter work is like we chose a single year, right, and a single treatment. And then the time variant part is like, when did fires hit the treatment? But like, this is giving us the like kind of timestamp of like 2016 treatments only. But we want to go beyond that, right? Because like not every treatment's going to have happened in 2016. So the latter work is doing this like basically kind of a moving window approach to like, when are you implementing, what's been the past performance? Now we have additional records that we can think about that. All the records at the year of treatment, the year after, year 5, year 10, year 20. And we can be building this like living, breathing data set in order to understand that treatment effectiveness and longevity. But So in this analysis, the only one that's variant is when did fire hit those treatments, just because this is trying to be controlled.
So it's me right that I
Yeah.
asked the last question. So so following up on Freddie's split looks like, but he had this question about like, off treatment benefits potentially.
Oh, yes.
Some of this work,
Sorry.
some of this kind of stuff too. So I just wanted to know, you don't have to go bring up another slide, but I just wanted to know was that you talked about, and I think, you know, there are a lot of different ways to talk about what is effective, what you mean by that. And I just want to note that one of the things that's, so a lot of the work that we do is, most of the work that I do in my lab is really empirical. That's sort of measuring on the ground, and you know, and you guys are doing it the other direction, and they're gonna be, which is great.
Right.
It's cool to see that. But one of the things that you'll get when you, like, for example, I was thinking when you were talking about the meat, you know, the moderate, like, yeah, you know, it's kind of a wash in there. However, there's another way of measuring effectiveness that we're not thinking about at all here, and that is whether or not, and this is where you got it to an
Yeah.
extent, is whether or not you change fire behavior sufficiently such that fire management staff will put down fire.
Yeah.
And what we run into in the Lake Tahoe Basin, because I've done, it's where I've done a ton of work, and right now I'm actually trying to find funding to do a project. What very nicely for what we're doing is we're
Right.
measuring empirically and all the plots we've
Yeah.
had for 25 years that burned and not burned. We're going to measure on the ground all this stuff. Trying to the you know, you talk to the manager, and you know, you walk through a stand that burned in moderate, even where they treated, because they didn't have fuel miles burned.
Right.
You know, treated like, okay, you didn't quite finish that one. However, all the fire managers go, oh no, what are you talking about? This thing worked great.
That we stood.
Yeah,
in
it went from a ground fire to a ground fire, and we were able to stop it right here. Okay, we wiped the stand out, all the trees are dead, but
Right.
darker, that was very effective. We burned no homes in the Caldor fire in the Lake Tahoe Basin. It was a freaking, people call it a miracle. It was not. It was product of an outrageous amount of work that had been done.
Right.
And they were able to put a lot of people in those treatments.
Right.
So, and they were able to use fire as a management tool.
Yeah.
So it's into this question of off-site protection, because when you can stop a fire, and Frank's work actually was looking at that. That's something else to think about is,
Yep.
I used to cry at the on ecologist. Okay, great, you stopped it. Trees are all dead.
Yeah.
It's what you wanted, you know, but there's something to be said about that, because under those conditions, you
Right.
didn't want that fire going.
Yeah.
Whereas, you know, of course, when it's low severity, we put the damn thing out. And that is, you don't want the fire to keep moving, you know? So it's
Right.
kind of back backwards. But anyway, I don't know if there's more of like a discussion or over beers or point.
That's like a Ruby Wildlands discussion.
Yeah.
Like treatment, right?
Exactly. So, but that's another thing to think about. is that
Absolutely.
Not just the like spatial measurement of did it stop the fire to move, but rather to what extent did it affect the ability of fire management personnel to stop that fire spot, which clearly has. I mean, you can imagine that, so that not burning. How many fire came within 700 feet of my
Right.
home?
Right.
And you know, if it didn't come into town, they probably. Yeah. Some bugs, you know.
No,
I'm not.
totally. I have like one idea around that, and then I'll let everyone go, and we'll talk about the rest of our beers, which is, I think, Q, part of what you're talking about is like, if there are a bunch of homes over here, we really care about, well, and actually something I didn't mention, but we talked about in the paper, is we threw this 200-meter buffer over the final fire perimeter. And we did that because we're like, gosh, we keep on seeing these treatments along the final boundary, right? And so an additional metric, and by the way, we care about that if like these are homes up here. You know, we care, like that might be effective or that success. Maybe we actually, you know, if this is low severity fire, and maybe, you know, in this case, composite burn index was low, like from an ecological perspective, maybe you actually want the fire to continue onward. But one of the future metrics that we're going to be including in this is the proportion of treatments that are either along a fire perimeter or in a fire interior. And so we're sort of like, how often is this type of approach associated with like operational control of fire, as opposed to like, you know, non-operational control in that it's somewhere way out here in the very large spatial footprint. So that is a metric that'll be coming down the line, and I think is another example of like, how do we generate a suite of metrics? And for operational control, you might care about that, but for, you know, biodiversity and forest health, we actually might say like, oh, that, you know, that control line really wasn't what we were after.
Cool.
I was just gonna say, one of the hidden things under here that I think is really important to Hugh's point is that fuel treatments fundamentally change how firefighters fight fire.
Yes. Yeah.
And so how suppression effort is allocated across space is determined by where the location of people.
Absolutely.
So to say that some of these effects you're identifying, which is important, but it's due to the fuel treatment itself versus whether it's the fuel treatment that led to more targeted fire suppression to happen.
Right.
Really important. Right?
Oh, absolutely. And so like, that's yet another reason why we threw this 200-meter buffer over here. And we said, okay, but like, basically they were able to get in the forest and suppress and like fight the fire.
Yeah.
And so we did another, I think it's in the supplemental somewhere where we said, okay, but what if we didn't count the ones that were like within a 200-meter buffer? Because those are actually the principal control lines for this final fire perimeter. But I think it's like both important to actually look at that benefit, as in could we actually do operational control in a fire, and also important to remove it and be like, but if I'm really just looking for forest health, maybe I don't want to include that in the set.
I mean, I had this question all along too, because it always irritates me, like, they're not accountable for how they're operating in the fire, but I feel like the first paper you were talking about, I feel like your design kind of allowed that to be washed out a little bit, so I feel like if you did, I mean, you didn't address it perfectly, but I feel like that first approach where you're just bidding things on the landscape or not, I mean.
Mhm.
I feel like
Suppression effort happens after that. Right? So
Yes.
doesn't quite get at that. So I mean, it would be different if you could somehow randomize where the fire suppression effort was happening, but once you basically choose where those fuel treatments are, suppression effort will be allocated differently across space.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And we can't predict where they're gonna,
Exactly.
Well,
well,
it's
not
gonna be where
perfectly.
the homes in near whatever.
Not perfectly.
I wrote.
you had a filter for that, right?
I do.
One of your filters
Yeah.
was,
Yeah. So this is the one you're talking
Yeah.
about where we're, and this is really through the lens of like feasibility, like not wanting to compare like something in the wilderness in order, next to something that had easy road access. But for similar reasons, in theory, your census-based area, like the combination of slope and road access would actually make it equivalent through the lens of operational control had a treatment happened.
And I get that it's like out of the fact that you're saying these are treatments that we're gonna assume happen instead, and we would assume that firefighters knew those treatments, but they're also used as operational books. At least that's how I see it.
Yeah, it's just gonna be problematic because fire suppression effort is not random, right?
Right.
So it's a self-selection problem.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, and there's things like I don't want to pretend that we can get every metric we've ever wanted out of this. It's kind of just like, here's the cohesive approach and methodological design in order to help us answer questions that I think have been to date hard to answer at landscape scales and at like very large sample sizes. There's a lot of actually great fire ecology scientists with great labs here in the room right now, but there's only so many of those labs and only so much field work we can do. And can we do all of that every year, all the time?
I think, so I really applaud your approach. I think it's very just a great way to try to look at this at larger scales. I guess I'm thinking in the end, like, I'm not sure it really tells a different story than what we find when we do measurements sometimes.
Oh, no, I agree with you, but see, that's the beauty. I think actually the
So I was,
The great-
this story because we measured on the ground too.
yeah, no, like nothing in this is like wildly drastically new outside of the scale at which we're finding basically the same result that a lot of the field-based.
Spatial temporal.
Yes,
I mean, to me, that was the very unique thing. And the dynamic baseline is, I think,
Yeah.
strategic spatial work, the way that you use the counterfactuals. We don't use that for science, but in economics, we use it all the time. That's a big deal. I think that's a huge deal.
Well, okay, just the heterogeneity across the different fuel treatments that you have to do, systematically understand unless you do something at the scale at which
Right.
you're doing. So it's really important.
And budgets, right, I mean, I talk about this all the time, because the built environment, we make huge decisions on expenditures with far less confidence than we have from empirical studies, remote sensing. So if we can reduce the use of the word uncertainty when we're talking about budgets, we're gonna have resources. Because we have empirical evidence of remote sensing, we move way faster and allocate more dollars towards land management than if we do, if we lean only on type analysis. So for me, remote sensing, empirical studies, all of that is really important to jettison the word uncertainty from funding control resources space.
Okay, we're done.
okay.
Thank you very much.